So this 42-year-old woman who sees these blue zones and really wants to emulate that in some way, when we talk about her life, it then becomes apparent to her as we underscore the key components of a blue zone that she's rather isolative, she's highly career focused, but she's been divorced for a couple of years, isn't dating, isn't going out with friends, isn't really connecting with her family of origin very much, who she has a positive relationship with, but she isn't considering that a priority in her life right now. Oftentimes people have a narrative. I have a healthy diet. But when we actually get the person to say, here's what I do for lunch, here's what I do for dinner on a regular basis, they find that a lot of the time the diet isn't so healthy. I'm Dr. Dan Monti. Welcome. So I recently had a patient who came in and said, I just saw this special on blue zones. How do I achieve what they do in these blue zones without actually moving there? How can I live to be 100 and healthfully? And that's what the blue zones are about. So there's 5 so-called blue zones in different areas of the world. You've got one in Italy and Sardinia. You've got the Okinawa Islands in Japan. You've got an area in Costa Rica. You even have one in the United States in Loma Linda, California. These blue zones have some commonalities across them, and we can adopt some of those behaviors and some of those lifestyles that are common to the blue zones because we know, and the data is out there, the science is out there, that the things that make a blue zone healthy are actually health promoting. One of them is diet. So across the blue zones, there's differences in the diet, but there's some commonalities. One, very low processed foods to no processed foods. So they're eating real food. This is hard to do in our present day culture. Convenience foods, snack foods, processed foods, microwavable foods, foods that come in a box, they have a lot of chemicals, they're processed, they're not in their natural state, they're convenient, but they're not going to give you that long-term healthy life expectancy you're looking for. They've lost a lot of their nutritional value. They don't have the living enzymes in them. We need fresh food and food in its natural state, and that's a commonality across these blue zones. Also, there's very little sugar additives in any of the food. Some of the diets allow for some fruits, so I always tell patients, fruit, but in moderation, because in the United States, we say fruits and vegetables. We always put fruits first. When we're talking about getting in the required amount of plants, it's really vegetables first with just a judicious, thoughtful amount of fruit because we don't want to be having huge spikes in blood sugar. And in these blue zones, they're not eating a diet where they have the high spikes in blood sugar. They're actually eating less than the typical American does. So the total calories tends to be smaller and they're eating more nutrient-dense food. So this is something that we should be thinking about all the time. In addition, for the most part, they have a higher activity level. They're walking more, they're doing more, they're more involved with taking care of things that have to do with physical labor. So they're more physically active overall. They're getting a lot more natural exercise just in their daily lifestyle. So we know for a fact that activity level is very much tied to longevity and healthy life expectancy. Then there's another factor that we very often look in this country, which is the connectedness, the social community connectedness that is often lacking in many people's lives. Social isolation and loneliness is as toxic to the system as a bad diet or exposure to harmful other things. There is an inflammatory process that occurs when there's loneliness and isolation, and that's why people really need to stay on top of that, staying connected to people that they care about, that are important to them, staying part of the social community, because it's very easy in American lifestyle with profession and worrying about making money and doing the other things that are so important that this social connectedness thing often gets wayside. If somebody doesn't have a spouse or a partner or a family that they live with, they can become very disconnected. In fact, people who do live in a home where there might be a spouse and family, they can often become very disconnected from them, not part of the family activities because they're just singularly focused on something that might seem good in the short run, but in the long run is affecting health. We know that people live longer, live better, if they actually have a good primary relationship versus not one at all. One of the mechanisms that we're very aware spurs the illness and disease process across the board of practically anything you can think of, from coronary artery disease to cancer, is inflammation. Now, there's inflammation we can't control, sometimes from genetic factors, sometimes you're exposed to an environmental toxin and you just are. Then there's inflammation that we can control. Our diet can have a lot to do with inflammatory levels, activity level, and also stress. And there's different types of stress. We call it psychosocial stress. So there's events going on in our life and how we navigate them, and do we have the tools to lower stress levels when things are going on. But a significant form of stress is actually social isolation and loneliness. We're not hardwired to be alone and isolated. We're just not. That's one of the reasons that we were able to sort of survive earlier times in our existence, was being connected in a social group. And so our neurology doesn't thrive if it's isolated and not connected. This perpetuates an inflammatory state because it's actually stressful. So what is stress? A psychosocial stressor is something that is perceived in the person's neurology, consciously or not, as a threat to well-being. And social isolation and lack of connectedness is perceived on some level as a threat to our well-being. And so in these blue zones, not only do people tend to have more primary relationships that are on the healthier side, but they also have more overall social connectedness. They're doing things as a community and a neighborhood and those kinds of things. So this 42-year-old woman who sees these blue zones and really wants to emulate that in some way, when we talk about her life, it then becomes apparent to her, as we underscore the key components of a blue zone, that she's rather isolative, she's highly career focused, but she's been divorced for a couple of years, isn't dating, isn't going out with friends, isn't really connecting with her family of origin very much, who she has a positive relationship with, but she isn't considering that a priority in her life right now. So this was an important thing. Also, as we looked closer at her diet, in order to be as high performance as possible, she wasn't really being thoughtful about what she was eating throughout the day, and often just grabbing snack foods, eating pretzels or chips or things like that for lunch as she was in front of her computer, noticing that she is starting to feel a little more fatigued, probably what actually stimulated the whole question of how can I live more like in these blue zones. So even though she watched the special, she hadn't yet taken inventory on how she's different. Sometimes that just requires a conversation. And that conversation between the two of us was somewhat illuminating to her, because oftentimes people have a narrative. I have a healthy diet, because they think about healthy things they might do here and there. But when we actually get the person to say, here's what I eat for breakfast, here's what I do for lunch, here's what I do for dinner on a regular basis, they find that a lot of the time the diet isn't so healthy. And so these are things that really we kind of unravel and work on together. Also, she had been very active when she was younger. She used to run, she used to play tennis, she injured her knees, so she stopped doing all of that a few years ago. She let her gym membership slip, and she realized she wasn't doing much of anything. And so in this case, we kind of got her back on track, thinking about those kinds of things. Now, also, because she didn't come into the office just to talk about the blue zones. What got her there is she noticed she wasn't really feeling her best. And so when I looked at her blood work, I realized she was becoming a little bit anemic. Her diet was obviously quite off. And also, her liver function studies told me that she was probably having too much alcohol. She admitted to having a glass of wine at night, but then when we got talking, maybe it was 2, maybe it was 3. And so dialing all of that back and starting to take care of herself, take care of her diet. We talked about some supplemental nutrition, things that she could do for breakfast that would really be nutritive. There's a smoothie recipe I gave her. Really, in a short period of time, she got a lot of that energy back. She felt motivated then to go to the gym, and she's on her way to sort of a blue zone lifestyle. I'm Dr. Dan Monti. Until next time, be well.